Good morning. Welcome to our 18th session of the Palliative Care Journal Watch program. My name is Leonie Herks, and today we'll be joined by my co-host, Dr. Sharon Watanabe, and our guest panelist, Dr. Vicky Baracos. Next slide, please. The Palliative Journal Watch is a regular series of webinars that keeps you up to date on the latest peer-reviewed palliative care literature. This program is led by experts from several divisions of palliative care and palliative care medicine across Canada and internationally. Our team of academic clinicians is on the lookout. We regularly monitor over 30 journals and highlight papers that have the potential to challenge us to think differently about a topic or confirm our current practices. Next slide. Before we dive in, I'd like to share a quick note about the broader initiative behind today's session. This program is part of the Palliative Care ECHO project, which is made possible through the generous support of Health Canada. The goal of this project is to build strong communities of practice and support ongoing professional development for healthcare providers across the country who care for people with life-limiting and serious illnesses. If you'd like to explore more, we encourage you to visit our website at www.echopalliative.com. There you'll find information about the project as well as details about our upcoming ECHO sessions on a wide range of palliative care topics. Next slide. While the Palliative Care ECHO project supports ongoing learning, it builds on a strong foundation like that provided by Pallium Canada's LEAP, Learning Essential Approaches to Palliative Care courses. LEAP offers interprofessional, evidence-based training that equips healthcare providers with the skills and confidence to deliver compassionate, patient-centered care. Courses are developed by Canadian palliative care experts and are available online, in person, or in hybrid formats. LEAP features practical case-based learning and offers continuing education credits and nationally recognized certification. You can learn more at pallium.ca/courses. Next slide. What to expect from today's session. Let me take a moment to walk you through how things will unfold today. This episode is going to be a little different from our usual Palliative Care Journal Watch. Today we're zeroing in on a specific and important theme, cachexia. We've selected 4 key articles that we'll be highlighting and discussing in detail. These represent some of the most interesting and relevant work on the topic that our team of contributors have come across. At the end of today's session, we'll also share a list of honorable mentions, articles that also caught our attention but that we don't have time to unpack in detail during today's session. A quick note, this session is being recorded and we'll be sending the recording out to all registrants within the next week. You'll also be able to find the webinar recordings, slide decks, and links to all of the articles we cover on our website, www.echopalliative.com/palliative-care-journal-watch. And if you prefer to learn on the go, you can listen to our sessions through the Palliative Care Journal Watch podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. Great, let's get started. Next slide, please. My name is Dr. Leonie Herks, and I'll be co-hosting today's session. I am a palliative care physician and currently medical director of the Children's Hospice and Palliative Care Service here in the Calgary zone with Alberta Health Services and a clinical professor at the Cummings School of Medicine. I'm also the senior scientific director of Covenant Health's Palliative Institute. Over to you, Dr. Sharon Watanabe.
Hello. So I'm Sharon Watanabe. I am a physician based at the Cross Cancer Institute, where I'm medical lead for palliative care. And I'm also a professor within the Division of Palliative Care Medicine at the University of Alberta.
Thanks, Sharon. And Dr. Vicky Baracos, over to you.
I hope everybody here is in good health and in good spirits. I'm a professor and a PhD qualified researcher, devoting most of my research, both clinical and basic, towards discovery in cancer cachexia. I'm also a member of the clinical practice guideline groups of ASCO related to this distressing symptom.
We are so grateful and privileged to have Vicky with us today, an internationally renowned expert on this topic. So I hope you enjoy the discussion today, and thanks again for joining us, Vicky. Next slide, please. In terms of disclosures, Pallium Canada is a not-for-profit organization that's received funding from Health Canada. Aside from receiving the funding from Health Canada, Pallium also generates funds through its course registration fees and the Pallium Pocketbook. My disclosures are, I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and neither do any of the other panelists. The Scientific Planning Committee has complete independent control over the development of course content to mitigate any potential biases. Next slide, please. Okay, so today we're going to be reviewing 4 articles. The first is Multi-Component Interventions for Adults with Cancer Cachexia Systematic Review. The second is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study of olanzapine in chemotherapy-related anorexia. The third is looking at mirtazapine in also a randomized placebo-controlled trial. And the fourth is looking at ponsegromab in the treatment of cancer cachexia. So we're just going to dive right into the first systematic review. Over to you, Dr. Watanabe.
So the title of this paper is Multi-Component Interventions for Adults with Cancer Cachexia Systematic Review by Bowers and colleagues, published in the Journal of Cachexia, Sarcopenia, and Muscle. So as we are aware, the pathophysiology of cancer cachexia is complex and therefore suggests that there may be need for a multi-targeted intervention. And many trials have, in fact, embraced this multimodal approach using combinations of pharmacological, nutritional, exercise, and or psychosocial intervention components. And it is not known how many of these multi-component interventions have targeted all the key features of cachexia, or whether interventions that target more of these features of cachexia are more effective at improving patient-centered outcomes, including quality of life. In addition, the effect of tailoring interventions, that means offering interventions only to patients who are expected to benefit because of the underlying pathophysiology in that person, and also adjusting the dosing of that intervention has not been fully explored. So the objective of the study was to synthesize studies of multi-component interventions for adults with cachexia to evaluate the extent to which they have actually targeted the key features of cachexia and have been tailored to individual patients, and whether these characteristics of targeting and tailoring of multi-component interventions are actually associated with differential effects on the main outcome of quality of life. So, this investigative group undertook a systematic review and they focused on adults with a diagnosis of cancer. And in each individual study, at least 75% of participants had to be at risk of cachexia. And so, for the purposes of their review, they focused on patients with advanced lung, upper GI, and head and neck cancers, although they also included a small number of patients with other malignancies. And for a intervention to be considered multi-component, it need to target at least 2 components, either concurrently or sequentially. And they included both randomized trials and non-randomized trials. And as we'll see, the randomized trials are in the minority, and they investigated a number of databases, clinical trials, registers, as well as the gray literature. They assessed risk of bias using accepted tools, and they extracted the category of the intervention, the type, the specific type, which features of cachexia were targeted, and to what extent these interventions were tailored to the individual patient. That means targeting and individualization. And they also examined if the studies looked at quality of life outcomes, and if they did, then they did a separate analysis of quality of life. Next slide. So They identified 62 studies that had multi-component interventions in the target population. 39 were randomized and 23 were non-randomized. The median age of the population was 64.2 years, and the median weight loss at baseline was 10%. And you can see there the distribution of tumor types, with the leading ones being lung and GI, followed by head and neck, and then some other malignancies. And 81% had stage 4 disease. So in those 62 studies, identified 232 individual components. So breaking them down by type, 40% were nutritional, 27% exercise or physical activity, 22% pharmacological, and 9% psychosocial. And then breaking it down in which aspects of pathophysiology were targeted. So 44% were targeted at energy intake, 27% at physical function, 28% at weight or muscle loss, and 19% at metabolism. And in terms of tailoring, a total of 54% demonstrated either partial or full tailoring of the intervention. And when they looked at quality of life outcomes, so only 13 of the studies actually had quality of life data, out of which 10 were randomized and the remainder non-randomized. And when they assessed them for risk of bias, all of them had high or critical risk of bias, or at least a concern of bias. So in those studies that had quality of life scores, um, uh, the quality of life scores declined in 2 and improved in 11 with the multi-component intervention. There was no indication that the number of features of cachexia targeted or the extent of tailoring had any association with the degree of improvement in quality of life scores. 4 of the studies actually compared multi-component intervention with usual care, and in 3 of them, the quality of life scores improved. In the fourth, quality of life declined in both arms. So the key discussion points from this systematic review is that it's the first study of its kind that actually mapped out in the literature what are combinations of interventions being used to target cachexia, which features of cachexia were targeted, and what was the degree of tailoring. So, so a lot of this was descriptive in nature to see, what's out there and being examined. Um, and they did feel that the non-randomized studies were still valuable for descriptive purposes and generating ideas for randomized studies, but by nature, these non-randomized studies do not lend themselves to adequately assessing the effectiveness of the interventions, and so large randomized controlled trials are still needed. And they noted that the psychosocial aspect of cachexia was targeted in only a small proportion of the studies, and felt that that should be addressed because there is a growing body of literature looking at the psychosocial component of cachexia, and they recommended that these interventions incorporate tailoring to the individual, and that quality of life should be measured as an outcome. So, strengths and limitations. So they did. Uh, this is a useful addition to the literature from a descriptive perspective, but in terms of looking at the efficacy of multi-component interventions for cachexia. Is difficult to draw conclusions because of the high risk of bias in the small number of studies that could be analyzed for this outcome. So at the moment, in terms of practice impact, it's unclear if multi-component interventions do indeed have a significant impact on quality of life in cachexia. So I would invite reflections from Dr. Baracos.
Some review, I think, unbundles several sources of profound frustration with the cachexia field. This seems to include a jumble of interventions. So all sorts of different drugs and exercise therapies, nutritional therapies in a jumble of combinations. And those are targeted at a jumble of outcomes. And this is extremely difficult to fathom if you were walking into this field from a therapeutics line in especially in cancer care. So this is all very murky, and I think what this arises from is some lack of clarity about what cachexia is and about how to discern how an intervention may reverse some of its components. So I think a real limitation of this is that the authors of this review have set no bar. So you would ask the question, do clinical practice guidelines of ASCO or ESMO cover this same literature? ASCO indeed would not have included most of the papers in this review for the reason that ASCO set quality guidelines. One, that the trials were randomized, which would have excluded a number of included here. Secondly, that they include at least 20 patients per arm, which would have excluded others. And then ASCO would have demanded, as I think rightfully should be conceded, that it is the primary endpoint of the study, the stated primary endpoint, the planned primary endpoint that would be used to judge whether the trial was gave a positive result, an equivocal result, or a negative result. And so for that reason, exactly none of these are included in the ASCO clinical practice guideline with a recommendation. So that is a testament to a small volume of rather limited evidence of rather poor quality. There strikes me also another question that people have failed to think about very carefully is if you take all the listed interventions in this review that investigators put together into a multi-component package, I would argue to you that exactly none of those have been proven to have efficacy as a single agent. And that, I think, is the pitfall that the investigators have been making, is if none of these are efficacious as single agents, then to what end combining them would cause efficacy to appear? There may be a rationale behind this, but it is something that I think anybody would realistically struggle with in terms of a concept underlying putting together these diverse multi-component interventions. Last, I think these authors have tried their best to dig quality of life, always a secondary outcome in most of these clinical trials, and bring it to light. And I guess my reservation there is this cachexia-related quality of life, or isn't it? And because the vast majority of this is a generalized cancer related quality of life, many components of which are not in any way, shape, or form related to cachexia, it identifies a further area. We really need a cachexia quality of life tool to find out whether we are helping people with concerns that they have with the cachexia that they experience.
Wow, amazing insights, Dr. Baracos. I think some of the points you raise are going to come up in the subsequent articles. So I think if it's okay, we'll move on to the next slide, and we'll dive into a different type of article, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. So uh, this study is by Sandia and team who are based at a tertiary care center in southern India. Was published in 2023 in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And it's, as I said, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study looking at olanzapine for chemotherapy-related anorexia in patients with different types of cancer, which I'll go through. So um, as we know, I think anorexia is, very common in advanced malignancies, and it can be exacerbated by chemotherapy. Um, it can affect, over half of newly diagnosed cancers, especially known to be prone to it are those with gastrointestinal and lung cancers. It can be associated with insufficient oral intake and compromised nutritional status. It can indirectly worsen chemotherapy tolerance and compromise cancer outcomes. Current guidelines recommend dietary counseling for anorexia, but there's limited data to date to support a specific pharmacological intervention for appetite stimulation. And olanzapine has garnered much attention because of its ability to stimulate the appetite. It's an antipsychotic with both dopamine and serotonergic antagonism activity, and there are some studies looking at its use in advanced cancer, and it's been shown to, when added to megestrol, it can increase appetite in both advanced GI and lung cancers. It's commonly used, as I'm sure we've all seen in our practices, for short duration therapy in patients with cancer as an antiemetic around chemotherapy in particular, used typically as a 5 milligram once daily dosing. But its effect on appetite requires more extended use than it's typically used in oncology. So um, this study was really to look at, can continuous use of low dose olanzapine improve appetite and weight gain among those newly diagnosed with advanced lung and upper GI cancers who are starting chemotherapy. So, as we've discussed, is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study focused on adults 18 years of and over who have untreated either locally advanced or metastatic upper GI cancer, so gastric and hepatopancreatic biliary cancers and lung cancers. Uh, both groups, the placebo as well as the treatment groups, received nutritional assessment as well as dietary advice as the standard of care, and then either received 2.5 milligrams of olanzapine daily or placebo for a period of 12 weeks. With respect to outcomes, they looked at weight gain greater than 5% and improvement in appetite using both the visual analog scale and the FACT ACS, which is the Functional Assessment of Chronic Illness Therapy System of Quality of Life questionnaires, anorexia cachexia subscale, which greater than equal to 37 is known to be positive. And those were the primary outcomes. And secondary outcomes, they looked at overall nutritional status using a subjective global assessment tool to document nutritional status as either well nourished, moderately nourished, or severely malnourished, and a 24-hour dietary recall to calculate both calorie and protein deficit, as well as quality of life. So again, as Dr. Baracus said, secondary outcome, and looking at chemotherapy toxicity. Next slide, please. So there were 124 patients who were eligible to be enrolled in the study, and um, with some further exclusion criteria, there ended up being 112 who were put through for final analysis. Groups are approximately equal, 58 in the intervention arm and 54 in the placebo arm. The median age was 55. The vast majority, so 80% of participants had metastatic cancer rather than locally advanced, and just over half of those were gastric cancer, just over a third were lung, and the remaining 10% was hepatopancreobiliary. The baseline characteristics were similar between both groups. In terms of primary outcomes, the olanzapine arm was significant for both increased weight gain of over 5%, so 60% of intervention participants versus 9% of placebo, and improved appetite by both scales, visual analog scale as well as the FACT ACS. Visual analog scale, I think, can be argued a bit more subjective, but there was 43% of the intervention arm had improved appetite by VAS, and by FACT ACS, 22%. Both of those significant over placebo. When you look at the secondary outcomes, the olanzapine arm was significant for both improved nutritional scores at 43% versus 9% for placebo, and the proportion of patients receiving over 70%, that should say, sorry for the typos, of recommended daily caloric intake at just over 50% versus 18% for placebo. The olanzapine arm was also significant for improved overall quality of life from baseline, 70% versus 50% in the placebo. And they also had reduced grade 3 to 4 chemotherapy toxicity of 12% versus 37% seen in placebo group. And they noted that there was minimal side effects of the olanzapine. Only 2 patients who were in the treatment arm reported drowsiness, which was mild and short lasting. Next slide, please. So in terms of key discussion points, and there's a lot of data that you can go through if you're interested in learning more about the study. So I'm really giving a broad overview. We know that there are a few studies addressing anorexia in the context of newly diagnosed cancer receiving active chemotherapy. What they found was that low-dose olanzapine as 2.5 milligrams daily was well tolerated, and not only improved appetite, but also weight gain in this context of newly diagnosed upper GI and lung cancers. Certainly, there's a concern that longer-term use of olanzapine is needed for appetite stimulation, and that being on it longer term might cause additional toxicities. But they found that the adverse events attributable to olanzapine, mostly drowsiness, were very mild and manageable. So, the authors certainly felt that concern about the longer-term use of olanzapine did not bear out in their study, and felt that it was very safe and effective. In terms of strengths and limitations, it's a 12-week study period. So, of course, we don't have any info on sustainability of those effects beyond the 12 weeks. There's a heterogeneous group of cancers between lung and different types of GI on various different chemo regimens. So that, of course, muddies the waters a little bit. And anorexia itself is a subjective measurement, and addressed in this study, they tried to minimize kind of the bias around that through different direct and indirect measures. So they used 2 different scales for appetite. They measured caloric intake as well as nutritional status and weight gain. And so they tried to minimize any bias through that broad kind of assessment. They noted that their study was exclusively undertaken in a tertiary care center where there was experienced dietitians, and that may not be available in all centers. And of course, importantly, they did not assess any impact on survival in this study. So interestingly, the journal editor for the Journal of Clinical Oncology was the one who suggested this practice impact in the overall context of this publication, and suggested that the study was significant for us to consider adding low-dose olanzapine along with the standard of care of dietary advice for patients with newly diagnosed advanced lung and upper GI cancers to improve appetite and weight gain. And I'm super curious to hear Dr. Barricos's insights into this different type of article that we've just broken down. So over to you, Vicky.
Thank you. This study appears in a period of time I would probably refer to as a drought of phase 3 studies. There have been perhaps 5 phase 3 studies on cancer cachexia completed in the last decade and a half. 3 of those have not been published. The ones that were published were investigational new drugs and they failed regulatory approval. That was anamorelin, failed regulatory approval in the United States and in Europe, but achieved regulatory approval in Japan. So this is the first phase 3 study, and I think in contrast to the further studies you're going to be talking about, this is not an investigational new drug. So any new IND in this space has to go through phase 1, first in human, phase 2, and then phase 3 to be approved by a regulator for the indication of cancer cachexia or anorexia. That means the entirety of the investigational new drug space is populated with stuff that may come into clinical practice a decade from now. In the meantime, it's probably not ill-placed to look at already approved medications. This one has the charm that it is appetite-inducing and could be used in a cachexia context for that reason. It's also a not bad anti-nauseant, and it is being prescribed around the world off-label in highly emetogenic chemotherapy context. It's actually a very good medication to that purpose. So you could understand why people in this space, desperate for something to prescribe, would head for existing drugs. And I think it's a great subject for a phase 3 trial. This was uniformly positive, and the positive aspects ran right through the whole gamut of primary and secondary endpoints, including distal things like a suppression of treatment-related toxicity, which is also highly significant. Whether all of those positive results bear out in further trials of this agent, we'll learn soon, because other centers around the world are trying to recapitulate this phase 3 trial. But based on its apparent strengths, the ASCO Cancer Cachexia Clinical Practice Guideline Group defined this as a justification for a rapid update, and that rapid update aligns with the suggestion at the bottom of the practice impact on this slide. So they were comfortable in recommending a trial with this agent to see if it could help people out with caveats.
Thanks. Any comments, Sharon?
Thanks, Vicky. Just one question. I guess the patients who received olanzapine gained weight, but we don't know what kind of weight. Is that
Right.
an important question?
Important question, but one that sits in a kind of funny space. For investigational new drugs, the regulators would require body composition to have been done. That's missing from this. It's not actually plausible that that weight would be entirely, because it was a 4.5 kilos overall difference between the two treatment groups, that it would be entirely composed of such substances as adipose tissue or water. But that remains to be verified.
Thank you.
Thanks. We'll move on to the next article, which again is using an existing therapy, as you're describing, Dr. Barricos, to find something in this space that might be helpful. So this is looking at mirtazapine as an appetite stimulant in patients with non-small cell lung cancer and anorexia, a randomized trial by Arietta et al., and it was published in JAMA Oncology in March 2024. So again, I think we've covered a lot of this around anorexia, that it's an abnormal appetite loss leading to insufficient oral intake, decreased functionality, can affect tolerance to anti-cancer treatments, and can impact survival, and affects at least half of patients with lung cancer specifically. And similar to our previous article that we discussed, there's no specific pharmacological intervention that's recommended to improve cancer-related anorexia. Mirtazapine is a promising agent, which, because of its association with appetite stimulation and increased body weight when used in other settings, most often for mood disorders, it has central serotonergic antagonism with both antidepressant, antiemetic, and some analgesic effects. So in this objective of this study was to assess the effect of mirtazapine both on appetite and energy consumption in patients with advanced non-small cell lung cancer. So it was a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial with adults 18 and over with advanced non-small cell lung cancer receiving active oncologic treatment and who had anorexia as defined by an anorexia cachexia score greater than 32. Patients received mirtazapine 15 milligrams once daily for 15 days and then were increased to 30 milligrams once daily until 8 weeks, or alternatively received placebo. They did comment that crossovers were allowed, but I didn't find any information in the paper really to address what the impact of that was. So I will be curious to see if anyone else read anything further in the paper about that. And of course, all patients received kind of a standard of care, personalized nutritional advice. In this paper, unlike the previous one, they did assess anthropometric body composition, and appetite all at baseline, as well as at 4 weeks and 8 weeks after treatment. Primary outcomes included both the appetite score as well as energy consumption and the percentage of the energy requirement met or achieved. And in terms of secondary outcomes, they looked, as I said, at body composition, including sarcopenia. They looked at health-related quality of life, the hospital anxiety and depression scale for both depression and anxiety, as well as safety of the medication with respect to adverse events. Next slide, please. So in this study, sorry, next slide. There were 114 patients who were assessed, and of those, 86 found to be eligible. Initially, there were 43 patients enrolled in each arm of the trial, and by the 8-week follow-up period, there were 58 remaining in the trial, with 31 in the mirtazapine arm and 27 in the placebo arm. The demographic and clinical characteristics were balanced and similar between both arms of the trial, with a mean age of 63.5 years. Over 57% were women, and the vast majority, 90%, had an ECOG status of 1. Similarly, the vast majority had metastatic disease, and most were receiving first-line treatment at 70%. And of those, over half were receiving tyrosine kinase inhibitors, standard chemo in about 40%, and then a minority immunotherapy at 4%. With respect to the anthropometric and nutritional variables, 11% were underweight. The median anorexia cachexia score was 19.5. Again, all of these similar between the groups. And 66% of those in the study had sarcopenia. In terms of primary outcomes, the appetite scores were significantly increased in both arms, so both in placebo and mirtazapine, at the 4 and 8 week mark. But they noted that at 4 weeks, the mirtazapine arm was significant from placebo for both increased energy intake, which included both protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And then at 8 weeks, while both groups had increased energy intake by that point, there was a significant increase in the percent of the energy requirement achieved. And the mirtazapine arm reached 100% of their requirements. And when you look at the breakdown of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, the mirtazapine group also had significant increase in the fats specifically, as well as protein consumption versus placebo. When you look at secondary outcomes, the mirtazapine arm had a significant decrease in the proportion of patients with sarcopenia, so 57% versus 83% essentially. The health-related quality of life was increased in both, but the global health status significantly increased in the mirtazapine arm. The HADS anxiety score was significantly improved in the mirtazapine arm at 4 weeks compared to placebo. And then at 8 weeks, the HADS depression improved, but not significant from placebo. And they made note that there was no difference in adverse events between the two groups, especially between the GI and non-hematologic effects. There was nightmares that were more frequent in the mirtazapine arm at 2 weeks, but then by 4 and 8 weeks of the study period, that had fallen off and was no longer an issue. And perhaps not surprisingly, the mirtazapine group had less fatigue compared to placebo at the 8-week study endpoint. Next slide, please. So they were in this paper wanted to address that while there was no difference in appetite score from mirtazapine versus placebo, the mirtazapine group had a significant increase in their energy consumption at 4 weeks, which was maintained through to 8 weeks. And they interpreted this because of the significance of the fat intake, that it was largely due to increased fat intake. And there's some evidence in the literature that increased fat intake is associated with improved respiratory function markers, particularly in patients with lung cancer, which of course they didn't assess here, but they made note that that would be something of importance to look at in future. There's increased energy intake, of course, is the first step to addressing unintentional weight loss and can have an impact on stabilizing body weight or increasing body weight. And so they were inferring that, if mirtazapine has affecting energy intake, even though it's not affecting appetite, that there may be some benefit to weight loss. While there's no difference in the weight change at this point with mirtazapine versus placebo, the mirtazapine arm had significantly diminished proportion of patients with sarcopenia at 8 weeks and stabilization of the fat-free mass at the 8-week period. So, and I can't wait to hear what Vicky has to say about this. This is obviously an area of your significant expertise, Vicky. And in previous reports, mirtazapine has been associated with higher prevalence of somnolence and hallucinations, but in this study, they said it was overall well tolerated, and there was no cases of people dropping out or issues with somnolence, and the nightmares were short-lived and not apparent at both the 4 and 8-week mark. So they felt that overall it was well tolerated and also had a positive effect on global health status and the HAD score, and they wondered if this was related to a positive effect of either better energy intake versus well-being or improved mood. And of course, that's not addressed in this study. So in terms of strengths, it's a first placebo-controlled randomized controlled trial to test the effect on energy intake, including carbohydrates, protein, and fat macronutrients, and looking at the toxicity profile of mirtazapine in patients with advanced non-small lung cancer with anorexia. Um, Lots of limitations, a single institution, overall very small sample size with significant dropout rate. Of course, the patients were all on different anti-cancer therapies, so how that interplays is unknown. And they didn't assess the response to their cancer treatments and how that might have impacted the results. And of course, the study period is only 8 weeks long, so very short. Interestingly, the authors themselves suggested that this study was significant enough to consider addition of mirtazapine in patients with advanced non-small lung cancer and anorexia as a nutritional intervention, and that was the wording they used, to improve energy consumption. But my read of this is that really we would need further studies to look at the role of mirtazapine based on this, and obviously a longer-term effect of mirtazapine in cancer-related anorexia. So very curious, eager to hear and learn from you, Dr. Barikos and Dr. Watanabe, about your thoughts on this trial.
More evidence. That is, the evidence in this area is woefully sparse. Now, you might ask this question. If you look at this on the surface, this publication and last one we discussed appear in the 2 of the highest impact factor clinical oncology journals, so deemed to be high quality evidence coming from India and Mexico, respectively, where in those countries that research is led by medical oncologists. We do not see research activity of this caliber on cachexia in North America, Canada, or Europe, emanating from the community of clinical oncologists. So this something fundamentally different here in intent, and also probably something fundamentally different in funding for these studies to have been carried off, and maybe a piece of community participation insofar as these studies are led by members of the medical oncology community. So now we have this specific trial on mirtazapine, and here you see something, an existing drug with some potential side effects that may mitigate cachexia, and some positive signs, perhaps not quite so positive as olanzapine in the Sandia trial. But all of these studies enlarge what they're doing with these secondary endpoints. And I think that is of value to try and find to get more information about how we might be improving the clinical benefit of these therapies. And that's the thing we are really missing collectively. So everybody's seeking which endpoints that will be meaningful to patients, nutritionally meaningful, cachexia meaningful, quality of life as broadly described meaningful. And that is a soft point. It is too bad, I think, that these trials are not run through a cooperative group that asks them collectively to put some pieces in that would allow aggregation of the clinical trials or comparison of the clinical trials per certain different specific endpoints. So schmozzle, I think, is a word that still applies to the whole enterprise, and that's going to require some leadership, which does not presently exist.
Any thoughts, Sharon?
Yeah, very interesting study. I thought I had the feeling like there were lots of analyses, comparisons, and I felt like the authors almost were searching for something
Yeah.
that would be, a positive outcome. I think it's valuable information, but as you've said, we will need some more studies to refine
Oh,
these
and
these findings.
nuance, perhaps. People who are sick and are on chemotherapy tend to gravitate towards foods with low energy density.
Mm.
And so actually, if reproducible, a spontaneous migration to fat-containing foods instantly raises the energy density of the diet,
Mm.
which could be a tangible nutritional benefit
Mm.
or for discussion.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Mhm.
Huh. Lots of food for thought. All right, Sharon, we'll move on to the last paper since there's so much
Yes,
we could talk about. I feel like we need
right.
a extra long session to get through all this rich material.
Yes. So our final feature article is ponsegromab for the treatment of cancer cachexia, and that comes from Groark and colleagues, published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year. So differentiation factor 15, also known as GDF15, is a stress-induced cytokine that binds to the glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor family receptor alpha-like protein, or also known as GFRAL, in the hindbrain. And so this GDF15 GFRAL pathway has emerged as one of the main modulators of anorexia and body weight regulation, and has been implicated in the pathogenesis of cachexia. And indeed, the level of GDF15 is elevated in the setting of cancer cachexia. So where ponsegromab comes in is that it's a humanized monoclonal antibody which inhibits GDF15. And there was a small open label phase 1b study that involved patients with cancer cachexia, and ponsegromab was associated with improvements in weight, appetite, and physical activity, and it also suppressed serum GDF15 levels. So the objective of this study was to assess the safety and efficacy of ponsegromab as compared with placebo in patients with cancer cachexia and who had elevated circulating GDF15 levels, to test the hypothesis that GDF15 is a main mechanistic driver of cancer cachexia. So, as per methods, it was a phase 2 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled multi-center trial. I think there were over 70 centers that participated. It included patients with cancer cachexia, defined as weight loss of greater than 5% within the previous 6 months, or greater than 2% with BMI less than 20. The serum GDF level needed to be elevated. ECOG would be 3 or less, and life expectancy of at least 4 months. So patients were randomized in a 1:1:1:1 ratio of ponsegromab, 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams, or 400 milligrams, or placebo subcutaneously once every 4 weeks for 3 doses. And the primary endpoint was change in body weight from baseline to 12 weeks. And they examined key secondary endpoints of appetite, cachexia symptoms, physical activity, and safety. Next slide, please. So a total of 187 patients were randomized. The cancer types were non-small cell lung cancer and 40%, pancreatic 32%, and colorectal 29%, and 90% of the patients were receiving systemic anti-cancer therapies. So at 12 weeks, ponsegromab groups had significantly greater weight gain than the placebo group, with a median between group difference of 1.22 kilograms. And then they give 95% credible intervals, which I understand are the same as confidence intervals for the Bayesian statistical analysis that they did. And then, so comparing that to uh, so it was 1.22 kilograms in the 100 milligram group, 1.92 in the 200 milligram group, and 2.81 in the 400 milligram group. So improvements were also seen across measures of appetite and cachexia symptoms, physical activity, and as well as CT lumbar skeletal muscle index in the 400 milligram ponsegromab group relative to placebo. And in terms of adverse events, the rates were similar between the ponsegromab and placebo groups. So the key discussion points, so this is, according to the authors, the first conclusive demonstration of GDF15 as a common driver of cachexia across different solid tumors. It shows that ponsegromab has the potential as a targeted therapy for cancer cachexia and possibly has implications for diseases other than cancer with elevated GDF. And apparently there is a trial ongoing in this setting of cardiac cachexia with the elevated GDF15. So strengths and limitations. So it is a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, but with a small sample size. And it is pharmaceutically sponsored, which is not doesn't invalidate the findings, is something to bear in mind. And of course, larger confirmatory trials are needed. So, Vicky, over to you for your commentary.
Picking up the cachexia banner here, possibly for these kinds of reasons. The identification of a specific molecular actor, which we haven't had in cancer cachexia before. And that specific molecular actor is a molecule which turns out to, when they were screening for people to have this molecular actor, and 95% of the people they screened for this trial had GDF15 at or above the cutoff level for inclusion. So it could be ubiquitous. It could be a ubiquitous mechanism. That remains to be seen. And it showed a dose-dependent efficacy. And that dose-dependent efficacy was revealed by some rather specific statistical methods that are quite hard to get your head around. So you'd have to appreciate that those statistical methods incorporate some differences in baseline values amongst the groups. So they're really complex, but judged to be powerful statistical methods. There are a certain number of oncologists who would walk right past this and say, great, but it's phase 2. This is not practice changing in the foreseeable future. It would surprise me profoundly if this pharmaceutical company went straight to phase 3. I would imagine they may be formulating some thoughts around doing one or more phase 2 studies in addition to the one they already have. Phase 3 being a rather big investment. And there are other things to weigh. One thing to weigh in the pharmaceutical world is, I'd remind you that olanzapine, which showed some efficacy in a clinical trial at phase 3, costs 23 cents a day. At the doses used in that study. Monoclonal antibody therapeutics do not cost in the pennies per day range. And one thing that remains to be seen is at what level cachexia drugs will be reimbursed in different jurisdictions. Where anamorelin has been approved in Japan, the reimbursement from the regulators is considered to be a non-sustainable value for the pharmaceutical company. So that's an issue. The other thing, though, I appeals to me about this paper, I think, has got to do with mechanism. And I've written an editorial alongside the Groarchy article, which you could read at your leisure, where I make the following case. The brainstem is the place where all the primitive responses lie. And in the area of the brainstem where you have nausea and vomiting and aversion, learned aversion, acquired aversion to foods, you have the receptor for pansegro for GDF15. And this part of your brain's job is to shut down food intake, vomit the food that was taken, and learn aversion to that food in case of having accidentally crossed something toxic or rotten. And so if that part of the brainstem is involved in cancer cachexia, those mechanisms are exceedingly powerful. And I think it's not by accident that these therapeutics, olanzapine, mirtazapine, ponsegromab, have action in the brainstem. And I think that will be an evolving story of great interest as to whether we will be able to modulate the cancer and chemotherapy-related activation of those centers. Because fundamentally, people with cancer, especially on systemic therapy, they don't eat. No matter how much well-adapted advice you give them and medical foods you give them, they simply don't ingest those foods. If this class of therapies could be successful in leveraging food intake, I think that would be a substantial hit. All of this remains to be seen. We hope that Canadian centers and researchers around the world will, at the very least, pony up participation in these clinical trials at their centers. You'll note Ottawa participation in the ponsegromab trial, and investigators in palliative medicine and clinical oncology would think about accruing their patients to these clinical trials where they meet the criteria for participation.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Berko. So many insights, and I actually wish we had a whole other hour because there's in each of these papers there's so many things we could discuss. But I hope you've given us lots of food for thought today, and a really great kind of snapshot of where things are at with anorexia and cachexia in cancer, and a call to action, I think, as well today for all of us to think about how we can better involve and advocate to participate in trials, and think about how we can, what are the most meaningful measures for our patients who are struggling with these issues. Sharon, I wonder if you might walk us through briefly the honorable mentions, because there was a few other papers.
Sure.
Yeah, and then we'll
Yes.
wrap up for today. Thank you.
All right. So these three honorable mentions are actually all review papers, and the different members of our editorial team like different ones for different reasons. So they're all listed for you here. So I'll just read them out. Updates in cancer cachexia, clinical management, and pharmacologic interventions by Pandy and colleagues, published in Cancers. Then top 10 tips palliative care clinicians should know about cachexia, published in Journal of Palliative Medicine by Bloom and colleagues. And then finally, cancer cachexia, published in BMJ by Ewell and colleagues.
Thanks, Sharon. And Dr. Barikos, any other recommendations you would have for palliative care clinicians in this space that you would want us to make sure we read about or know about?
Care physicians' capacity for pain and symptom management gets people to the place where they're able to eat food. That is the topmost, hugely important thing that must be understood. Secondarily, there are therapies which you might trial in your patients, which there is some evidence for efficacy and which are probably going to have limited side effects. And the last thing that's actionable is the participation in clinical trials previously mentioned. Thank you so much. This has been a very
Yeah,
interesting discussion.
thank you, Dr. Barikos. Next slide, please. So we'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today for today's Journal Watch session. In the spirit of continuous improvement, of course, we'd love to get your feedback on how the session went. Please fill out the feedback survey. And as mentioned at the beginning, a recording of this session will be available on the website and found in all podcasts are found. Thank you so much, Dr. Barikos and Dr. Watanabe, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next session. Have a great day.